So, welcome everybody. How are we all doing?
Fine.
We thumbs up or thumbs down in?
Monday.
Fine.
It's kind of in between.
Are we in between?
We're
Well,
doing okay for a Monday.
excellent. Well, if you like this or like this, special welcome. We're going to change that because we're going to talk about all things mental capacity, which is amazing. So yeah, what a way to start our week. A little bit about the session today. So we are going to record the kind of what we're going to call the planned part, which is the bit up until 12 o'clock. We would like to spend a good half hour on discussion. That is not going to be recorded, so you can absolutely feel free and unrestricted to share your comments and test things out. We want it to be a safe space. In that vein, this is what we call an exploratory session. So our goal is not to come today to kind of tell you what to think and to tell you what you should be saying about the consultation. We're coming in the spirit of these are the things we think are exciting and are good, and these are some of the things we think are a bit worrying. But it's very much in that spirit of collaboration and exploration. So we want kind of voices, and as we're a massive community, aren't we, advocates? We've got all types of advocacy that will be affected by the Mental Capacity Act. So it'd be really good to kind of hear what you guys think and then work out, kind of our positions. So what's going to happen is we're going to talk you through some of the main things. We can't possibly go through the whole consultation. So we've focused on the advocacy bits. So Demi. Hi, Demi.
Morning, everyone.
Debbie and I are going to kind of facilitate that bit, and we're going to pause. We're going to add commentary where we can. You're absolutely invited to kind of ask questions and comment, but just to keep some kind of structure to that session, we're going to ask that you do that in the chat box so that we can flow through. And then verbally comment and come on camera in the discussion bits at 12, if that's okay. Then we've got somebody going to ask a question then.
Sorry, it was me, and I'm jumping in only because you're talking about the thing of the day. Has anybody else had a thing for later on today about LPS as well, around 11 o'clock? From Rhiannon Baker? No? Cool.
No.
Okay, not to worry, I'll just leave. I didn't know if it was the same thing, because I had a lot of invites come through for this, and obviously the ones we've got going on throughout the week. And then I had this one as well, and I thought, is it the same as yours or not?
Definitely.
Not,
and let's be honest, it's not going to be as good, Let's just be honest. This is the place to know. Join as many, of course. Right. What was I going to say then? I've lost my story. Gail, where was I up to then in my?
You were up to share your questions while you and Demi are presenting in the chat.
Yeah, can't remember where else I was going to flow on to there. Not to worry,
And that was
I'm sure it'll come.
Were you going to talk about our guest speaker?
I was. Thank you, Gail. Yes, so can I get a woo?
Ooh.
We've got Neil Allen.
Yes.
Woo! Like a ghost if you want.
Well, I'm staying in this bit then. I'm not going at 11. I'll stay here.
Is right. What Neil doesn't know about MCA and Mental Capacity Act and LPS ain't worth knowing. So yeah, we're genuinely really grateful for Neil to come and join us. He's going to be speaking about 11:30. I fully expect there'll be overlap between some of the things Debbie and I are exploring and what Neil explores. There may even be some difference, which is great. Difference is good. Difference is where the thinking happens. So, that's a great thing. And similarly in that spirit, if you've got a different view, yay, that's great. We want to welcome difference and different ideas. But yeah, I am really excited that Neil can talk later. So don't miss that. We will be scheduling at least one comfort break because 2.5 hours is way too long to be sitting on Zoom. But we will just plan that by ear. By ear? we'll just plan that as we go. My expectation is it'd be about 11:15, give or take. That's the pleasure with Zoom, isn't it? You can go off for a wee or a tea whenever you like. Just don't take your camera with you. Right, shall we begin? We're going to start with a quick poll, if that's all right. So, want to get a feel for kind of the group today. So, have you, and be honest, there's no right or wrong. We don't know who says what. What are you kind of approaching today's session with? Are you approaching it having spent a lot of time looking at the consultation, like you feel you've got a good handle on it? You know this shit, you've read it a few times, you get it, you come in today to contribute and shape. Are you in that second group where you know there's a consultation, you might have dipped in and out of it, you might have a broad understanding, but actually you want to come today to get more? Or have you rocked up today because somebody told you to come and you're sitting there thinking, what consultation? And all three are okay, by the way. Okay, so 10 more seconds. 10 more seconds, and then I can share. 5 more seconds, quick, get hitting buttons. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so most people have some understanding, which is great, which is great. So let me begin then. Let's get going with our presentation. Okay. Everyone see this okay? Give us a thumbs up. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so yeah, as I say, really exploratory today. So we're going to be just highlighting some of the bits. We've done that. So let's give a little bit of background. So we're here today as a community because we've got a new Mental Capacity Act and Mental Capacity Amendment Act, which, as we know, is making some changes, well, massive changes to the DOL system, and we're going to have the Liberty Protection Standards, but it's also updating the Code of Practice, and that's the bit that's getting consulted on. So the two reasons that the consultant on the Code of Practice is because there's been so many legislative changes through case law that the code is kind of out of date and it needs updating, and also the new LPS system. So they're amalgamating the two codes. So we're going to have one Code of Practice at the statutory guidance, and that's what DHSA are currently consulting on. This is the timeline, which, as you guys will know, has changed quite significantly. So we're here, we're in autumn, where we're looking at the consultation. Sorry, we're here, we're in the public consultation. We don't know when it'll be implemented, but we can realistically expect it certainly will be this year and maybe next year. Okay, Liz, will everyone receive a copy of the slides? Yes, I think so. That'll be absolutely fine. You can have a copy of the slides. So let's get straight into it. So one of the things in the Code of Practice that is new, well, not completely new, they are tweaking, is the chapter on best interests. And what we are seeing in the chapter best interest is more of a move towards taking wishes and feelings into account. So at the moment, if you think about the best interest checklist, it says that the person's wishes and feelings have to be considered. And we know that there's concerns about that not being in line with the UNCRPD, which requires there to be respect for the wishes and feelings of the person. The best interest checklist just says you need to consider them. In the new code, we're seeing a bit more of an emphasis. And look at this language here. It includes clarifying that the person's wishes and feelings can be determinative. So that's putting, I think, more of an emphasis on wishes and feelings when best interest decisions are being made. And look at this bit where the decision is not one the person would make, then the decision maker has to clearly justify that. Now, I think that's quite exciting for advocates, because you can use that. You can ask where the decision isn't what you think the person would have made, why. and that's new. I think that's a good thing. That's a good thing. The code of practice clarifies that best interest decision is a decision between available options, so you'll be familiar with that phrase. I find that a little bit problematic. I'd be interested to hear what other people think. It bothers me because particularly for people who are stuck in hospitals and need to come out, and there's a lack of provision in the community, because there's a lack of available options, they often get stuck. And I think part of the advocacy role is intrinsically about looking at additional options. So I do worry a little bit if that's given local authorities like a get out of jail card. I don't know that I'm being a bit naive, but that does bother me that bit. I don't know what other people think. But then a good thing, so we go good, bad, good on this slide, is that the new code talks more around advanced statements and advanced care planning, and where the person has made them and contributed to them, then they should really be considered as evidence of the person's wishes when the best interest decisions be made. So we're kind of seeing a bit more of an emphasis, aren't we, on wishes and feelings. So kind of there's some of the comments that we wanted to make. So yeah, if you are feeding back in the consultation, you might want to just to think, and I'm keeping the chat box open on my slides. So if anybody agrees with things we're saying today or disagrees, do let us know, because that will help us to shape our thinking as well. Okay, let's move on to the main bit of the session, which is the chapter on MCA. So the opening preamble to the chapter talks about advocacy being a way of supporting somebody to have their voice heard. And it talks about MCA's work in supporting people who lack relevant capacity. When I read this kind of preamble, it really did bother me a little bit, because of the language being used. You know, even if the individual is unable to express their wishes or feelings. And it feels like we're in a different place now where do you know what, we recognize that it's not just about expressing. Everybody can express wishes and feelings. This idea that somebody's unable to express wishes and feelings, it's not true, is it? You know, unless you're in a coma, your behavior, mannerisms, breathing, you know, body gestures expresses wishes, feelings and beliefs. And for me, it really does bother me that throughout, kind of peppered throughout the code, and particularly MCA, and I'll show you a couple of examples where this kicks in. And I think we really need to move away from advocacy. It's not about community, it's about capacity to instruct, isn't it? And we understand this. I think people in our community, we would understand this as just as a signal, as an indicator that, you know what, this is when we use non-instructed advocacy. And when you read the chapter on the proposed chapter on MCA, there's very little reference to non-instructed advocacy, which I think is important, should be referenced. So I guess my question to you guys is, do you think that's important? Do you think it should be in the code and referenced? And what are your thoughts about this idea of unable to express a view? I think it's a bit problematic. I'll give you a second to read this, and I will read it out in case anybody has challenges reading the screen, perhaps on a phone. So 10.30 says the MCA must try to ascertain what the person's wishes and feelings might be, and the beliefs and values that would be likely to influence the person if they have the relevant capacity. The MCA should try to communicate both verbally and non-verbally with the person as appropriate. For example, this might mean using pictures or photographs, but there will be situations where the person cannot communicate at all. The MCA may also talk to other professionals or paid care workers directly involved in providing present or past care treatment and the person's family and friends in order to find out about the person's wishes and feelings. The MCA should also examine any written statements of preferences the person has made in the past while they still have capacity to do so. So my question, do you spot any problems with this? So I think it's worrying because professionals too readily make assumptions around capacity. Yeah. Any problems with this? So Kate said, yes, I do. Communication. Yeah. I mean, I was listening to a speaker the other day, and she absolutely hated the word non-verbal, as if it's, you know, an either or. It's more than just communicating. Yet other professionals might have an independent view and own agenda. Yeah. These are great points and great insights that we just need to be careful of, because, you know, once this code is published, it's published, isn't it? I've highlighted it in bold that the bit I've got really big problems with, which is this idea that there'll be a situation where the person cannot communicate. And just like it makes me roll my eyes. It's like, really, is this where we're at? You know, people can communicate, and there's something, isn't there? And I can see this idea coming through in the chat box. Some absolutely brilliant thoughts here. Whose responsibility is it to communicate with the person who lacks capacity? It's ours, isn't it? The duty, you know, whether that's kind of a moral duty or legal duty, it's my responsibility to find a way to communicate with you. And, you know, it's not your responsibility to communicate to me on my level. It's my responsibility to communicate to you on your level, and I mean level as in style, preference, ability, capability, whatever. And yeah, it has to be person-centered. I keep seeing this word coming up in the chat box. It's beautiful. Yes, Richard, totally on the social model of disability. It's about us moving, isn't it? And the danger, and I know people today on the session wouldn't do this, but the danger is that if we go down this idea that the person can't communicate, that's where that substituted decision making comes in, and people start making decisions for people without really thinking deeply about communication and advocacy out of every role. I mean, every role should be doing this, but advocacy more so than everything needs to be really challenging that idea and keeping communication, you know, finding a way, basically finding a way. And where you can't find a way, I think what we need the code of practice to do is then refer to non-instructed advocacy as a way to guide our actions, as a way to research that information, as a way to observe the person and make interpretations of likely wishes and feelings, rather than jump into that really quick. There's been so many comments. I'm really sorry if I miss any to comment, but Rosemary, I'm just looking at yours. Are they trying to encompass every possible situation? Probably, and that's what we want the code of practice to do, is to give us guidance about what to do. I think what I'm suggesting is that this isn't the right starting place, and where we can't establish somebody's wishes and feelings because communication is very unclear, or no matter what we've tried, it's uncertain and I can't find out. Then it's about using non-instructed advocacy rather than starting kind of here. So bit of food for thought. Then if I move on to other bits in the chapter that are new, we've got some really helpful text on how MCAs interact with other types of advocacy. And this feels like it's really welcome that it talks about recognizing there's different types of entitlements. For me, you know, people who come on our channel hear me say this time and time again: advocacy is advocacy. You know, MCA fundamentally isn't different from IMHA. Advocacy is about voice, it's about choice, it's about rights. It's the same role. The entitlements are the different bits. And this, I think, is a helpful way of acknowledging that somebody will have a different, might have a different advocate. The chapter goes on to talk about different types of advocacy, and yeah, for me, I think this is kind of quite welcomed. It talks about the same advocate undertaking the different statutory roles, if they're trained and if they're able to. If anything, I think it'd be nice for this to go a little bit more in recognizing that that's a good thing. And I think it's a good thing because what it does is it reduces the amount of new people in somebody's life. And I think we all want that. Generally speaking, most people don't appreciate lots and lots of professionals, you know, coming in. But particularly if you lack capacity and perhaps communication or understanding is something that we need to specifically work on. Having lots of advocates, we have to retell your story over and over and over again, or somebody else to get used to. That's not a good thing generally. So having one advocate across makes sense for the person. But then if I think about it from our perspective, from an advocate, you know, I see some awesome advocacy taking place because a Care Act advocate becomes the RPR, and the information that they've gathered as a Care Act advocate informs their work as an RPR. And then if that person needs an MCA, you've already got the relationship and the insight into this person's world and the rapport, the communication to be able to do that, you know, brilliant job. So I think that's a good thing. Okay, so here's the consultation question that we're going to draw to your attention. And the question, interestingly enough, isn't about the Code of Practice chapter. The consultation question talks about the IMCA regulations, and we're going to show you them now. I'm going to hand over to Demi, who will talk you through. But just bear that in mind, that the consultation question focuses on the regs, and what we're going to show you at the end is a separate email, because there's a consultation response and then you can email DHSC about anything. And we think that we still need to make some representations about the chapter 2. So Demi, can I invite you to take over and talk us through the regs part?
You can, thank you, Kate. Thank you. So yeah, so like Kate said, because this question focuses in quite narrowly on the regs, we thought it would be helpful to show you what the regs actually say, especially because the regulations can be quite tricky to piece together. So the draft regulations that came out as part of the consultation documents just amend the existing regulations that we already have. So there's a bit of sort of piecing things together like a jigsaw puzzle. I was saying to Kate, I just ended up throwing everything in a Word document and highlighting things in red because that was the only way I could make it make sense to me, trying to piece together 2 different pieces of the regulations. So this paragraph focuses on the functions of an IMCA in terms of where they're directly supporting P under LPS. So I'll give you a second to read through those, but I'll talk through them as well for anyone that's struggling to see the slides. So it says that the functions of an IMCA include assisting P as far as practicable in participating in any decision relating to the arrangements for their care and treatment or the proposed arrangements, ascertaining P's past and present wishes and feelings about those arrangements, and the beliefs and values that will be likely to influence them if they had capacity, ascertaining what alternative courses of action are available, so looking at any less restrictive options that might be available to P. Where appropriate, which is interesting use of language, I think, preparing a report for the responsible body in relation to those arrangements and including any submissions, and then maintaining contact with P throughout the period of appointment. And again, as is practicable and appropriate, which again, I think is quite interesting use of language. Can we look at the next regs, Kate? Thank you. So then this paragraph focuses on the support of the IMCA, that the IMCA will provide to the appropriate person if they're giving support to them. Again, so this is more focused on how the IMCA will support the appropriate person. And what's interesting to note here is that there's nothing here that specifies that the IMCA can provide any direct support to P in this situation. So it talks about the IMCA assisting the appropriate person to assist P as far as practicable to participate in the decisions. Again, supporting the appropriate person to ascertain P's past and present wishes and feelings, looking at least restrictive options, seeking a review of the authorisation, making any representations to the person who will be carrying out the pre-authorisation review, and then supporting the appropriate person to make any representations to the responsible body that will be necessary to secure P's rights in relation to those arrangements, and where appropriate, supporting the appropriate person to make an application to the Court of Protection. So the wording of these regs is focused on the IMCA supporting the appropriate person to do all of this, not the IMCA providing direct support to P themselves. And then the next set of regs talks about, so this is applicable where the IMCA is supporting P directly. And this is sort of the IMCA's role in challenging any decisions. So the IMCA can request a review of the authorisation. They can make representations to the person who's carrying out the pre-authorisation review. IMCAs can also, so you know that might be an AMCP. They can, again, make any representations necessary for the purpose of securing P's rights in relation to the arrangements, and make an application to the Court of Protection. So in terms of things we might want to think about in terms of putting together a response to the consultation, as Kate mentioned, this question focuses quite narrowly on the regulations and not on the content that's discussed in the Code of Practice. You might still want to say something about the code based on what Kate's flagged up earlier on in the session, and we'll share that email address at the end to give opportunity to send submissions through. So as I mentioned, the regulations that have come through as part of this consultation are just amendments, and so they've made amendments in certain areas, but it doesn't make any changes to the training requirements of IMCAs. They remain the same as far as I can see. So I suppose our question to you is whether you think there should be any changes in the regs, whether you think they should have made any changes to those requirements. There's also nothing in the regs about who can be an IMCA. There's a bit of detail contained in the code, but I guess do you think the regs should also outline who can be an IMCA? Do you think it's important to include that in the regs, or do you think it's appropriate to contain that in the code? There's also no definition of advocacy contained in the regulations, and we were discussing that this is something that has been sort of campaigned for previously, but that's sort of come to a halt in recent years. Do you think it would be useful to have a definition of advocacy included in the regulations? Would that help prevent any sort of ambiguity around what the definition of independent advocacy is?
Just on that, Demi, something else to think about is about one of the reasons a definition might be helpful in the regs is about the professional status of advocacy. And in other pieces of legislation, if you look at other acts and other regs, like speech and language therapists, it kind of says this is what a speech and language therapist does and is. I think there's a school of thought that we need that as an advocate, because that will help to clarify misunderstandings, but it will also give more of a professional status and weight. So you might want to think about if that's a good thing, to feed that back, and if it's not a good thing, then obviously not to. And then training, of course, comes with that. Having a professional status, is it enough just to say advocates should be trained? Well, a training could be a 1 hour online session that you just sit and don't really do anything with that. That's technically training. That's very different from an assessed qualification, isn't it? So if there's thoughts on that standardising, the raising of standards, consistency and status, then you might want to say some things. Sorry, Jen.
That's all right, thanks, Kate. And also something to think about is, as we noted when going through the regs, that the equivalent of the 39D role that we have now, that IMCA role in supporting the appropriate person is reduced from what that equivalent role is now. There's no independent support for the person. If the IMCA is involved and they're supporting an appropriate person, then their support is limited just to supporting them. So there's no direct support for P in that role anymore. So I guess something to think about in your response is whether you think the IMCA should be able to support both the appropriate person and P. Do you feel that the IMCA having that ability to support P provides that additional independent safeguard for P? Do you think that's an important part of our role? Do you think we should, as part of that process, be able to meet with P? have conversations with them and provide independent support to them as well. And should the regs make that clear? If so.
Just before we move on, if I can, Demi, Georgina's made a comment in the chat around this reflects the RPR role that will no longer be there. So you're absolutely right. I think what we're highlighting is that in the new system, the expectation is that the appropriate person or P gets the MCA, not both. Whereas under the current system, as you've said, the RPR can do, it's both. And I think that's the issue. So just to come back on that.
Thanks, Kate. So the regulations that give IMCAs the right to access records, so the records that are set out in section 35, paragraph 6 of the Mental Capacity Act, and the regs that give IMCAs the right to interview P are extended in the new regulations to include IMCAs that are working under LPS. There isn't anything explicitly in the regulations about giving IMCAs a right to meet with P in private, but that is contained in the main Mental Capacity Act. And there isn't anything around where the IMCA has a right to meet with P either. So I guess something to think about is whether you think it would be helpful to have those things included in the regulations for consistency throughout the Mental Capacity Act, the regulations and the code, so that they're all saying the same thing, or if you think that that's something that's more appropriate to be contained in the code. Should IMCAs be able to access people where they're living or where they're being deprived? As far as I can remember, I don't think there's anything in the code either about where IMCAs should have a right to meet with the person. So is that being left up to IMCA's own discretion? Perhaps a little bit of clarity around that might be helpful.
Oh, are you okay? Oh.
Sorry, Kate, can we go back two slides, I think? There we go. Yeah, brilliant, thank you. So paragraphs 1066 to 1073 also give us some further guidance on sort of what to do when the IMCA disagrees with the decision maker, or if they have concerns that aren't directly related to someone's compliance with the MCA. And paragraph 1070 talks about IMCAs having a steering group that they might attend, as which might have sort of representatives from the local authority and from the NHS sitting on. I'm not sure if that's the case. I know it's certainly not the case where we are. We don't have a steering group that we sit on. I'm up in Lancashire, just for context. We attend sort of best practice groups, which would have representatives from the local authority, from CCGs, from the hospital trust, but I'm not sure that would be sort of the best or most appropriate forum to try and resolve any disputes. I'd be interested to hear from people from other providers if they have any experience in terms of if they do have a steering group, and if so, sort of how that works. But it's not something that I've come across. I don't know, Kate, if it's something that you've come across or familiar with.
So Elsie's just said in chat box used to be a case back in 2007. Yeah, so when for people new to IMCA, when it was first launched in 2007, steering groups were massive, weren't they? It was kind of every local authority had a steering group, but it was all about implementation and support. And I wonder whether it's a bit of a throwback, without appreciating that in 2022 very few areas have a steering group. But it's interesting because, again, what we want the Code of Practice to do is to tell us about that process, about what do we do when we've got concerns. So if the Code of Practice is referring to systems and systemic ways of raising challenges that don't exist, then it makes sense for us to feed that back. And what systems would help you locally to feed back concerns. And, we should always hold in our hearts this idea of you've got concerns on the individual level, haven't you, for P and the appropriate, you've always got those concerns, but then you've got systemic concerns around the way the system is running and the way people are experiencing safeguard and the way people are experiencing the management of LPS. And we need a route, I think, to feed that back. And the good bits, of course, where it's working well. And I don't think there's much in the regs or the codes, is there, about that?
No. Thanks, Kate. So there's also very little mention of using complaint processes to sort of try and resolve any disagreements, which can be helpful. And we also feel that more emphasis could be made about when to raise safeguarding concerns, when they need to be raised, when it's appropriate to raise those concerns. And also there's no specific reference to working with 16 and 17-year-olds in the regs or the code, really. And it might be good to have some guidance around when IMCA might support a young person, especially as this is going to be brand new territory for a lot of us. Which brings us on quite nicely actually to the next section of our session, which is looking at chapter 21 and how the Act applies to children and young people. So LPS will have an impact on 16 and 17-year-olds. LPS extends the scope to include them. And in the Reed D case, it was held that those with parental responsibility can't give consent to authorise arrangements on behalf of their child, age 16 or 17, who lack the relevant mental capacity to give consent to to arrangements, which would amount to a deprivation of liberty. So an authorisation of some form will be needed, and because LPS extends to 16 and 17-year-olds, they will be brought within the scope of this. The new code, the chapter in the code details the legislation which, as IMCAs, we will need to be familiar with when supporting 16 and 17-year-olds. So, for example, the Children Act, and it also talks quite a bit of detail around sort of the processes that we need to be familiar with as well, in terms of education and healthcare plans, the process around looked after children. For quite a lot of us, we're going to need to upskill in terms of working with young people. As a service, you might already have contracts working with young people. You may have multi-skilled advocates that work with young people and are trained IMCAs as well. But for those of us that don't, our IMCAs are probably going to need quite a good deal of training in terms of getting to grips with this new legislation that we're going to have to be aware of, and the new processes that are relevant for 16 and 17-year-olds. So the consultation question basically asks how clear that guidance is in the code, explaining the interaction between LPS and the other relevant legislation. I think it's one of those really where you're going to have to sort of read through the chapter and feel if you think it is clear, because it's going to be brand new information for a lot of us. So I think it's going to be one of those, have to read through and see if it does make sense, if it is clear. The code talks quite a lot about how the LPS process should be combined with other processes for young people. So like the same emphasis on with adults, if they're going through Care Act assessments, CHC assessments, etc., they should be combined with the LPS processes where possible. There's the same sort of emphasis for young people, and if they're having reviews of their education and healthcare plans, if they're having looked after child reviews, they should be combined with the LPS process as much as possible. So yeah, a bit of a case of reading through and seeing how clear you find that guidance, if there's anything that doesn't make sense to you, if there's anything you think you need a bit more information about, something you need more clarity on. It's going to be a judgment for each of us to make and sort of feedback what we think there, I think. So some things that we've pulled out that you might want to sort of think about and consider is this paragraph at 21:14, which states that professionals must establish the wishes and feelings of the young person where it's practical and appropriate to do so. And that sort of raised a bit of a flag to us, really, because why is there sort of that caveat here? You wouldn't have that pre-framing, that caveat with adults. You have to establish the wishes and feelings of a person. So why is there this caveat with young people? When wouldn't it be appropriate to gather their views and wishes? Why is there a difference here between young people and adults?
Yeah, and if you think about that, the opening slides around best interests is absolutely finding out what the person wants. You don't have this dual system where, unless they're 16 and 17, in which case we only do that when it's practical and appropriate. Who decides when it's appropriate? I think it's quite concerning that 16 and 17-year-old rights potentially might be being framed differently. to something as fundamental as what they think.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And then also something that we came across, the code talks about the young person may have another statutory advocate, such as an advocate under the Children's Act. And if that advocate is also trained as an IMCA, then they may be appointed to act as the IMCA under LPS. If they've got that training, fine, absolutely. This next bit is where we were a little concerned, because it states that if they're not trained as an LPS IMCA, then they might be suitable to be the appropriate person. But that sort of flies in the face of what the appropriate person is supposed to be, really. The appropriate person is stated to be an unpaid role. The expectation really is that more family members or friends would take on that role. So putting in that a paid advocate can take on that role sort of muddies the waters there, and would also, you know, with children's services and adult services being largely commissioned separately, that could cause some complications around commissioning as well there. So we feel there needs to be a little bit more clarity on what's meant there. In what situation are they envisaging that it would be appropriate, and why is that? Why is it different here for young people than it would be for adults?
Yeah. So. Am I taking over for the next chapter?
I think so, yeah. I think it's back up to you now, Kate.
Just conscious that we're going for 45 minutes, so now might be a good time to just pause and open up it, kind of what's going on for you right now and what you've heard. What are the things that you perhaps excited about? What are the things that are terrifying you, or you feel like we need to come together to lobby for? Now, we're going to have a proper discussion later, but just what are some of the headlines? Just want to pause for a second and to pop in the chat box. What are some of those things? Or you might have some questions. Gail is monitoring the chat box for questions as well. So if anything's not clear, I'm just going to pause for a second. I'm really conscious there's a lot of text here. There's a lot of information. So we're pausing.
Kate was wanting to clarify, was that chapter 21?
In the new code, yes, there'll be a new chapter, chapter 21.
And Fiona had a question about reports, and I'm trying to find it now. And why wouldn't it be appropriate to provide a report?
Why wouldn't it be appropriate to? I guess so the question will be, do you feel the code of practice clarifies that? Do you feel the code of practice gives you enough guidance to work that out? And if you don't, we'll then feed that back. There will be scenarios where a report isn't required, and that could be because you know, you've visited the person for many months, everything's settled, everything's fine, you haven't got anything to report back on. Could be that it's a very, very quick decision and there's no need for a report. And it's also, has anybody seen the Sky Guidance 42? That's what it's called, Sky Guidance 42. It's brilliant. It's about IMCA and advocates and report writing. And in that, it talks about a report doesn't need to be a big formal written 10-page templated document. A report can be an email. A report can be, you know, verbal presentation in a meeting. And for me, that makes sense, because that then gives the advocate some flexibility and professional judgment around what's the best way for me to make these representations. If it is a particularly complicated decision, you're deeply concerned about breaches and rights, you need to reference the law. I'm not doing that in an email. I'm doing that in a big kick-ass, you know, structured report. If everything's fine, then I think an email is okay. So I think these types of questions, if you don't feel the code of practice is answering and giving you that clarity, that's the bit I would be feeding back. Amanda said about lack of clarity about visiting. Yeah, that's something, isn't it, around how often we should visit. Demi, did you want to come in on anything about that? I know we've talked, haven't we, around how often should an IMCA visit? because there is a requirement to visit, but it doesn't stipulate how often.
No, the code just leaves it up to sort of a best interest decision for us to take, which is interesting in itself. But yeah, that's as far as the code goes, really, isn't it? And I think we've had discussions about, in terms of a bit of a minimum baseline would be helpful in terms of making sure that people's rights are upheld, really, and ensuring some form of baseline. And again, in sort of strengthening our arguments for funding with commissioners, because if there isn't a baseline, you know, will commissioners then be tempted to only require us to visit a lot less frequently than we feel we need to be doing to be able to do the job that we need to do? You know, if we'll be able to make a judgment on how often we feel we need to visit in our own cases to be able to really build that rapport with the person and make sure that their rights are upheld. Without a minimum baseline, is there a bit of a concern that we will be asked to visit too infrequently?
Yeah, definitely. I remember being part of discussions a few years ago around almost like a traffic light system, where many people have participated in this discussion about, you know, red, yellow, green. So if somebody's identified as red, that would mean things are unsettled. There might be a concern about the person's life and the care planning or the deprivations. And for people who are in red, you know, I know this is a bit crude, the MCA would effectively visit frequently, so 2 weekly or monthly. And people in yellow might be a bit more settled. You might visit every month or 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And then people in green are people who are very settled, and then you would only visit maybe every 3 to 4 months. And at first, you know, I think, yeah, that's a sensible idea, until you then think, what's 2 obvious problems with that? Any ideas?
It's your perception, isn't it? It's not necessarily how it is. It's your perception of what you think should happen rather than actually safeguarding the person.
Yeah, which is interesting, because somebody has to make a decision. Somebody, you know, we need to make a decision about how often to visit. I personally think it makes sense for the MCA to make that decision, because you are person-centered. You have got the person's, you know, heart and spirit and what's going on for them in what you do. But yeah, Kate's got it. You know, someone can go from green to red very quickly, and if you're not visiting frequently, and there isn't like a mechanism to trigger a visit, then that means that somebody's going to be bloody miserable for 4 months. And we know, you know, if you're at end of life, that matters. That really matters. The other concern, and forgive me, I'm being able to keep up with the comments in the chat, but the other concern is that commissioners could, not saying they will, but they could put everybody in green. So kind of, because there's that everybody becomes the default position is a 3 to 4 month visit, and you know there are some people that you might want to visit weekly, you know, for a short period of time. So there is something that we need to think about and discuss more around what we think that is. But yeah, a good starting point, I think, would be for the advocate to be shaping that and having some autonomy. Think about professional status, you know, you should be able to make that decision.
You can see loads of people sharing lots of concerns and really well thought through concerns in the chat, and really just to sort of encourage that you find some ways to share those back. The consultation is open. The consultation is open for a reason. It's so that we have an opportunity to feed back to Department of Health and Social Care about what we think is good about the code of practice and where we think there needs to be a greater level of clarity. So all of these areas that are feeling uncomfortable for you, or where you feel there is a lack of clarity, then absolutely this is the moment, isn't it? We've got till the 7th of July, haven't we, to respond to the consultation. So it's really important, I think, that there's a strong representation from the advocacy community.
Yeah. Thanks, Gail. Okay, we've had a pause and a breath. Are there any other big questions that have come through, Gail?
Pat Pat is asking, so there's lots of conversations about the need for a definition of advocacy. There's quite a lot of conversation around support to the appropriate person as opposed to P. And Pat's just asked, what was the reasoning given in previous legislation for how visits frequency are determined? What's the reason given for changing?
So I stand corrected if I'm wrong here, but I don't think it's ever been set out how often a visit should be, has it? It just says MCAs should visit, and of course you have a right to visit, so that's continued.
And Georgina is asking how to add views to the consultation.
We will tell you later, Georgina. So you've got two options. You can do your own consultation response, or you can feed into a sector-wide consultation. So Charlotte Gill from Voiceability is leading on a shared consultation response. But we'll show you later how to get involved, and we really welcome. I think stronger together is the motto.
I'll pop the links in the chat as well to where you can find the consultation documents online.
Yeah. Okay, then let's crack on. So challenges, disagreements, disputes. So just to kind of highlight a few things that the new code is kind of helping to fix. So it does give clarity. So there is a difference, isn't there, between a complaint and a dispute. So a dispute is when you disagree, which is a good thing. Yay! Disagreements doesn't mean people are bad. And there's a massive problem in our world, isn't there, where we think, if we disagree with somebody, one person has to be wrong or one person's bad. In a mental capacity world, families who disagree are often seen as bad, and we really want to get over that disputes are fine, disputes are welcome. Dispute is where the discussion happens. A complaint is different. A complaint is where you're unhappy, you want something changed, and the new code kind of just clarifies and offers a little bit of clarity. And it's got a really interesting table for when you read the chapter, because you will read the chapter, won't you? Say with me, I will read the chapter. I will read the chapter, because this is important. You'll see a lovely table that kind of outlines different routes to complaints. A couple of things to think about. Something about advocacy before I go to commentary. So the advocate, it talks about the advocate's role in disagreements and disputes, and it starts strong. It talks about us representing the individual. It uses the definition in the advocacy charter that we all know and love so well. It then talks about recognizing we're not mediators. But you know what I have a problem with? I have a problem with the word but. You can't say an advocate is not a mediator, but, oh, you might help settle a disagreement. That's mediating. So it's nonsensical to me to have that word but. We are not mediators. End of. We do not mediate. We represent, we push, we challenge, we support people to make decisions, we protect rights. We do not mediate in disputes and disagreements. So it sits a little bit uncomfortable that we've got this but word, because it's trying to, I think, square a circle. For me, I would like that a bit clearer, that we are there to support the person. And, especially when what the person's saying is, not well received or agreed with. That's even more important, that they have somebody to push for that. Using advocates can help people at the heart of decision making, and this is great, I think, in protecting what we do. It's just a shame that in a chapter on disagreements and disputes, what do you think should be in that list? Any thoughts? Any offers on what else we should put? Yes, Jane. Absolutely, Jane. Absolutely. Challenge. Yeah. We should, I think, be having in that list, in a chapter of disagreements and disputes, the right, the duty of an advocate to raise concerns, to challenge to challenge decisions, to challenge decision-making processes, where the person would want to, or where the advocate is concerned. So just a couple of little things around advocacy. Okay, so this is the question, the consultation question. How clear is it explaining, including when to take things to the court of protection? So some things to think about. I think we've covered that. Okay, 24.42. Sorry, just catching my bearings here. So yeah, in some cases, the person may not be happy with the arrangements. Sorry, I've got that many chat box open on my screen. I can't see the actual text. So where the person may not be happy with the arrangements or the authorization, but may be expressing that they do not wish to challenge it. Where this is the case, someone such as the MCA or appropriate person may need to challenge the arrangements in court, because if the person is unhappy, then the Article 5 rights are likely to be at risk. So I think this is a bit more complicated, I think, because sometimes people say they're not happy and they also don't want to challenge it. And those two views can absolutely be held, that they're not in direct contradiction with one another. You can be unhappy, but you might not want to challenge it. And I think that this might be suggesting that if the person's unhappy, the IMCA will kind of go. I know it says may need to challenge the arrangements, but it does worry me a little bit. You know, would you guys really pursue a challenge where, when you've had a conversation with the person, they don't want to pursue a challenge? I don't think you would. I don't know. What do you think, Demi? Have you come across that?
Yeah, it's something I've come across. If the person was very strongly telling me that they didn't want to challenge, I don't think it would be something that I would do unless I had concerns about their safety, for example, or if there were other human rights sort of coming into play, because I would be concerned about the damage that would do in terms of the advocacy relationship. Yeah.
Great point. And again, you know, we look to the codes to give us that guidance. So that might be something, if you agree, that we could say we would like more guidance on when it may be appropriate to challenge, under what circumstances. Because yes, you're right, Alison. I just read your comment. It depends on the reason why the person doesn't want to challenge. Is it because they're frightened or fearful, or is there something that we can unblock to open up that route to court? I mean, the court itself, it is a scary thing, isn't it? When you say to somebody about court of protection, you know, to you and I, it's a good thing. Yay, it's a protective thing. But I think to most people, say court of protection, it sounds like a criminal court. It feels scary. So you're right. If we can unpick that, does that then make it more accessible? But bottom line is, yeah, we probably want a bit more guidance. Okay. So I'm gonna have to close some things now. I can't. I've got too many chat boxes open. So some other things to consider. In fact, Demi, do you want to pick up on this? I think you're better at explaining this about the process and how it's set out. Could you help?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, this sort of came from sort of discussions we'd sort of had with other advocacy providers and their sort of interpretation of this chapter. So paragraphs 2432 to 2449, so quite a lot of paragraphs, discuss making an application to the Court of Protection if someone is unhappy with the arrangements and they want to challenge those. So there's quite a lot of information and guidance given there in terms of sort of looking at people's behaviour, etc. But interestingly, there's no explicit reference to the RD case law. It does sort of talk about elements of it in terms of considering behaviour and whether the person's actively trying to leave, so are they packing their bags, etc., are they trying doors, but there's no sort of explicit reference to the RD case law by name. So I guess I've just flagged that up in terms of is that something that would be helpful, do you think, to include in the code, given that it's a case that we probably all go back to when we're thinking about whether to raise a challenge. So would it be helpful to set out that there is actually case law there that we can refer to, and it is case law, it's not just guidance, because that has that status then, doesn't it? So yeah.
Emmy,
Yeah,
there's a question
sorry,
from Amanda in the chat, and Amanda asks, does it fit with the current guidance flow chart about when to challenge from the Court of Protection decision where the RPR is making a decision on behalf of the person?
And that's the RD guidance, isn't it? And I think that going back to what we were talking about before in terms of would we raise a challenge if the person didn't want to, and sort of where does that fit within RD as well? So I think that would be relevant in both situations there, wouldn't it, really, in terms of the guidance. So yeah, whether you think it would be helpful to include that in the code in terms of that status as case law. But the other bit I wanted to sort of just talk through, and it would be interesting to see what you think when you do read this chapter. Paragraphs 2450 to 2454 then go on to discuss the different steps that an advocate can take, or anyone really, in take when challenging the arrangements, authorisation or process of LPS. And it sort of gives you a bit of a bullet point list in terms of raising it with the responsible body, having those conversations, making a complaint, requesting a review, and then an application to COP. And some people have come back and said that makes it sound like there's a process and sort of a checklist and steps that you have to follow before you can sort of move on to the next one. So starting informally with raising things with the responsible body, going on to making a complaint if that doesn't get the outcome that you want, sort of going on to request a review, and then sort of finally making an application to the Court of Protection, which, if that is what it's implying, that's not always going to be appropriate. You know, if you're supporting someone who's telling you that they want to apply straight to court, you know, we're likely to go along with what the person wants to do in terms of challenging. And there is reference made in the earlier paragraphs about supporting and following what the person wants to be supported to do. So in terms of those other ways of raising a challenge might be appropriate in some situations, but if this is suggesting that there is sort of steps to take and a process to follow, maybe it will be helpful that there's some clarity of using those if and when appropriate, but keeping focus on supporting how the person wants to challenge, because raising things with the responsible body, making a complaint, that might be more appropriate where there's been issues with say the process, how the process of LPS is being done, but that wouldn't necessarily materially change things for the person because they're not unhappy with the arrangements, but you want to flag that the process hasn't been followed properly, that could be appropriate. Or if the person is unhappy with a couple of the restrictions, but generally overall they're happy with their placement, then a review might be appropriate in that setting. But I think there will be a lot of situations where following those stages wouldn't always be appropriate, especially if the person's objecting and especially if that's not what the person wants. So yeah, it would be interesting to see what you think when you read that chapter, if you think that that's what it's implying. I'm not sure if it does, because there's such a focus on the Court of Protection, but I know a lot of people have said that there is a process, but maybe that's a problem in itself, that different people have got different interpretations of this and how that should be followed. So maybe that in itself implies that it's perhaps not as clear as it could be.
Thanks, Demi, that was perfect. Okay, definition. I think this is over to you again.
Yep, I'm back in. So chapter 12 is the chapter that tries to really focus in and define what a deprivation of liberty is. We don't have an explicit definition. It was decided and agreed when the Mental Capacity Amendment Act, was going through Parliament, that it would be better to leave it out instead of putting in a statutory definition, and instead try and define it through text and scenarios, case studies, etc. in the Code of Practice. So just a quick reminder, three parts, three elements to a deprivation of liberty. So the objective element, whether the person is being confined in a restricted space for a non-negligible period of time. So this is where we would refer to the acid test as set out in the Cheshire West case. The subjective element, the person hasn't validly consented to that confinement, and then whether the state is responsible for the confinement. So the consultation question that focuses on this is asking us how clear we've found the guidance in chapter 12 at explaining the meaning of a deprivation of liberty for practitioners. It's quite a lengthy chapter. It tries to break down each element of the acid test, really. It references Cheshire West and then goes on to try and explain each element. And then it also provides us with quite a lot of scenarios, case study examples to try and help conceptualize what a deprivation of liberty is. So we were just going to flag up two examples of those. So I'll talk through this in case anyone's having difficulty reading the slides. So Jennifer is in her 80s and lives in a care home. She's in the early stages of dementia. Whilst in the care home, she can freely come and go from communal areas and into her room. The care home has staff that conduct a routine check of all the areas, but there is not a member of staff present at all times. The care home has a large garden, which Jennifer can use freely, although it has an alarm which is triggered if a resident tries to leave the premises. Jennifer usually goes out once a week with a family member when they visit, without permission from staff, and sometimes on excursions organised by the care home. So what do you think? Do you think this is a deprivation of liberty? Thinking about whether Jennifer is free to leave, or if she's under continuous supervision and control? And Kate's helpfully put a poll up for us. Brilliant. I'll just give a few more seconds.
Would you like me to do the countdown clock?
Go on then, Kate.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. It's closing. Oh, it's still moving. Like 3 more seconds. 3, 2. Quick, get your votes in. 1. Right, tough. It's finished now. Here we go.
Okay, wow. So 94% of people think yes, this would be a deprivation, and 6% have said no. So I will read you what it actually says in the code. So it says, this in itself is not a deprivation of liberty. There is
Say that again, Demi. Say that again. 94% said it is.
Yeah, so the code states that this in itself is not a deprivation of liberty. There is some supervision, as would be expected in a care home, but it is not continuous in either the communal areas or in her private room. And she is also able to leave temporarily. I can see a lot of comments coming through on the chat. A lot of shocked faces. Yeah, and Elsa said many scenarios in the code contradict what has been written, and I would agree with that, to be honest. I think we'll talk a little bit more about sort of the issues that we've flagged up with through discussions, but yeah, it seems what is written in the text of that chapter, when it comes to the scenarios and applying that, it does seem to conflict with what's actually being written. Oh, I think we could spend all day talking about these scenarios and what we think about them. So I will move us on to the next one.
Yeah, and I think, we understand that part of the goal is to reduce the number of DOLS authorisations and to make things care planning quicker and smoother. But there remains massive concerns, doesn't there, about this misunderstanding and what does constant supervision mean? And if these case studies are, absolutely critical in helping us to apply the legislation. So we've got to be feeding back about this. Yeah.
So then we have the example of Edward. So Edward has severe dementia and has been placed by his local authority in a nursing home. He has nowhere else to live. Edward is on a locked ward and he is not allowed to leave without permission and one-to-one staff support. He spends most of his day in a communal day room where a member of the care staff is always present. He goes to his bedroom sometimes during the day and is in his room during the night. When he is in his bedroom, the care team check on him roughly every half an hour. So again, what do you think? Do you think this is a deprivation of liberty?
Just getting the poll up and running. Sorry. Save. Ah. Okay, Zoom is not playing with me. It won't let me launch the poll.
I can see lots of people in the chat saying yes.
Yeah, just pop it in the chat. Sorry, guys, it won't let me launch it for some reason.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much a resounding yes. And again, I'll read what it says in the code. Actually, no, I won't because I've not written that down. But this is an example of where the acid test is met. But what's interesting, of all of those scenarios in the chapter, there's quite a lot. I don't know how many off the top of my head, but there are quite a lot of scenarios. But this is one of only two where the code states that the acid test is met, which we think is quite concerning, especially because this is quite an extreme situation. If we compare, to Jennifer, this is a very extreme. I've picked up some comments in the chat where someone's put, is this a nursing home or a prison? Sort of what crime has Edward committed? It's a very, very extreme example. There's that presence of one-to-one support. We feel those, and the other example is very similar. There's a lot of one-to-one support in place as well. So we feel out of all those scenarios, it would have been a lot more helpful to have more scenarios where the acid test is met and in less extreme situations as well, where there's not that one-to-one support in place. And another sort of concern we had about the scenarios was that, as I mentioned before, the code tries to break down each element of the acid test into different elements, and it gives scenarios to illustrate that. Fair enough, that's perhaps the easiest way to illustrate that, but what it doesn't then do is come back together and give a scenario of someone's situation as a whole and how each element of the acid test is satisfied or not satisfied. We think it would be helpful to see the bigger picture and look at it as a whole, really, which these scenarios don't really do. Again, we have some concerns as well about the text of the chapter as well. The text is unclear in places. Or it seems to imply some slightly strange notions. Like there's a part where it seems to imply that if you're in a care home but you have options of other care homes that you could move to, then that means you are free to leave. As someone mentioned in the chat, there's the text and the scenarios are sometimes quite conflicting. The scenarios also don't mention whether someone lacks capacity. It just states sort of what their condition is. So whether they have a learning disability, whether they have dementia. We were quite concerned with that as well in terms of the use of language and whether that would perhaps cynically give professionals a bit of a license to just then assume that because somebody has a learning disability, then they lack capacity. There's sort of a dangerous sort of link there. We also felt some of the language used wasn't particularly helpful, and I think it's quite reflective of that scenario we've just flagged up with Edward, that the language in there again is perhaps not very helpful, considering lots of people have made that reaction that it sounds like a prison. But also there's scenarios that talk about complex needs, challenging behaviour. We felt these were quite outdated terms now, and people are starting to unpick what they actually mean rather than using those as blanket terms. What was that phrase you used to sum it up, Kate, that I thought was beautiful in terms of what someone had said about needs? Like, needs are only complex if you don't know how.
Yeah, my needs aren't complex because I understand them. They're only complex when you don't understand me. So yeah, we don't like the way complex needs or challenging.
Yeah, as I mentioned, there's only 2 examples in that whole chapter of when the acid test is met, and those are very, very extreme sort of situations. So we think more scenarios that show when the acid test will be met will be helpful, and consider sort of less extreme situations, especially where there's not one-to-one. Because I think a lot of people have flagged up concerns that these scenarios seem to be going back to sort of pre-Cheshire West situations. And obviously, as I've seen coming through in the chat, the Cheshire West still stands, the code can't change that. And the code does reference Cheshire West. So again, the sort of that conflicting information that runs throughout the chapter. Something we've also been thinking about, sort of in discussion with other advocates and providers, and something that I've flagged up with our advocates within our service, is thinking about people that we're supporting currently under a DOLS authorisation, that are unhappy with their restrictions. We've supported them to challenge those in the court of protection. But if we applied the scenarios in the new code, if we applied those to those people, they wouldn't necessarily meet the acid test as set out by the code. And sort of the concerns we would then have, this would be people quite heavily restricted in some of these scenarios. They would be quite heavily restricted, possibly unhappy with those, but even if they weren't, they're heavily restricted, but no, if they're not deemed to meet the acid test, they wouldn't be eligible for an LPS authorisation. And so there will be no safeguard in place to protect those people, you know, unless they had a Care Act advocate come along to their review. They could be left without any, and if they don't have any family members who can support them to challenge, there could be people left quite heavily restricted with no safeguards in place to protect them, which we thought was quite a concern.
Yeah, well said. And wouldn't it be interesting if everybody who had supported somebody access to voter protection who wouldn't hit the new criteria, if you shared that story with Department of Health and Social Care so that they understood? Because I don't think they'll necessarily appreciate that. But you guys do, you know the impact, so share, you know, in the right way, or feed that back. I'd encourage you to do that. Do you want me to take this one?
Yeah, back over to you again, Kate. Thank you.
Have a glass of water. Yeah. Okay, so there are expectations around how long the key processes should complete, and very, very simply, it says that the authorisation should be completed within 3 weeks, so 21 days, and the responsible bodies have 5 days to acknowledge an external referral. So some thoughts to be thinking about. We do think there's value in having time frame. Obviously, lots of us are massively concerned at the current scenario because people are left, you know, for years, aren't they, in potentially unlawful arrangements and are denied. So we think that a time frame is important. We are equally concerned about the demand on MCA, and actually to do proper advocacy, to really think about supported decision making. That takes time, and non-instructed advocacy takes time. So there's a balance there, isn't there, between how do we protect that time that we need whilst not slowing down the key processes. And I don't think there's an obvious answer necessarily, but it's something that we need to be thinking about. And you guys know some people's lives are more require more input and require more focus and dedication, you know, because things aren't going right. Other people, it might be straightforward. So there is that gap, isn't there? But so yeah, something to think about. Concern, especially given how person-centered the new process be, that the 21-day timeframe make it more of a process by meeting the timeframe rather than supporting the person. So yeah, I suppose that point we just made around, will we be holding up the process unnecessarily, and is that a bad thing or is that a good thing because it's better to get it right? I don't know. Demi, did you have any views on that you wanted to share?
It's about trying to find that balance, isn't it? Because like you said, that's the really difficult part, because if we lose that time frame, then we can end up with sort of the open-ended situation that we have now, which obviously we want to improve on. And that's what all of this is around. And if we have a time frame, then it sort of strengthens our arguments to commission in terms of, you know, this is a deadline that we have to meet. We need to be properly funded to resource that. But when the whole authorization process needs to be completed within 21 days, you know, to improve on sort of the 39-day IMCA situation that we have now, there's probably situations where that's not always the best person-centered work that we can do if we're already working to the timeframes of local authorities, if we need to get it done quickly, which a lot of services do. It only leaves us with one or two opportunities to meet the person. And if it takes someone a while to be able to build that rapport with you, to open up, you know, it can take longer than that. But especially since there's such a big role in that pre-authorization period of supporting the person to actually understand what's happening, understand what's either in place or being proposed, you know, that could take a while. And I guess there's just a concern that the responsible bodies, with them having to sort of meet requirements of the data set, and especially with the code sort of suggesting that going beyond the 21 days would be an exception and wouldn't happen that often. It talks about it being in exceptional circumstances, but it might not be that exceptional. It might be more routine that it takes that long to be able to get it right. Because if it all needs to be done within that time, it's how person-centered and how fully involved can the person be. You know, if we've already been involved as advocates, if we work with someone as a Care Act advocate leading up to this deprivation needing to happen, or if we work with them as a change of accommodation IMCA, we might have already built that rapport, we might already have an idea of what their views are, they may already have an understanding of what's happening. So that process may be a bit quicker and we may be able to work through that. But for someone that we're meeting for the first time, I think that will be really difficult. But I do think it's important to try and find a balance in terms of having some sort of time frame and some way of making sure the person has the safeguards that they're entitled to, but also making sure that they're as fully involved in this process as they should be. So it's a really, really difficult one.
Tricky. Yeah. I've just looked at the time and somebody has stolen 20 minutes from me, and I don't know who, because I didn't realise it's 11:30 and we should be going over to Neil. So I am going to talk really fast on the next few slides. There is questions around data collection, okay? We will give you these slides. There are specific questions about IMCA. For people who've been around more than 10 years ago, you will remember the IMCA database with its glorious, how many questions with the Gail? 40? Elsa, 40 plus pages. We're not returning to those days. However, fundamentally, we think we have to collect data on advocacy because it's a stick, it's an accountability stick to hold local authorities and decision makers to account about referring and funding proper advocacy. So we fully support kind of data collection. So there's some things that are being asked. Do you think there needs to be more asked? Possibly. Or what do you think? So I'm just putting that one out there very quickly. The next very quick one is the impact assessment. The impact assessment tells us what we expect things will cost, how many people will have an advocate, how many appropriate persons will have an advocate. When you look at the impact assessment, you will 100% shit yourself. Okay? You are absolutely going to be terrified because it's massive. This is absolutely massive. We think it's going to be like 4 or 5 times bigger than current funding of IMCA. We're talking millions. We're talking 11,000 new full-time equivalent IMCAs. 11,000. That's how big the LPS is going to be. How many people, how many IMCAs we're going to need over the next few years. It is massive. A lot of people are coming to this discussion kind of concerned about what we've got now compared to what we've got. And I kind of understandably saying, we're nowhere near that. We can't possibly deliver. We can't possibly absorb that. I would just urge you to look at what is being suggested rather than, you know, what we've got now. We've got a spreadsheet, and if anybody wants to know the projected number of MCAs, I'm not going to go through every, because there's 150 local authorities, but it's about 5 times bigger than what you think now. It's bigger than Care Act, it's bigger than everything.
Is it worth, Demi, you just sharing your comparisons between now and what you think's coming?
So in terms of these figures, it's really, really difficult to try and get an estimate of whether we think those are going to be right. So what I've tried to do is sort of try and get a bit of an idea of what our referral rate for DOLS is now, in terms of our 39A cases and our paid RPR cases. For us, that was coming out at higher than 25%, but our local authority are quite keen on putting in paid RPRs rather than family RPRs. Whether there will be a slight shift in perspective once LPS comes in just because of the sheer numbers, I'm not sure. But also in terms of the role of the appropriate person is a lot more extensive than the role of the family RPR. And so I wonder whether as many family members will be happy to take on that role, which in turn might push up the number of direct MCA support is needed, or if that means that more than 40% of appropriate persons will need MCA support, because that's less than half. And this is a brand new role. And I do wonder, given the how extensive it is, especially that involvement at the pre-authorization stage, whether family members will have the time to be able to facilitate that, as well as whether they'll feel comfortable to do that without support. We've also had discussions about whether there should be sort of an opt-out system for the appropriate person to have MCA support, and if they're taking on that role for the first time, that should come with an automatic referral to an MCA unless they can justify to the responsible body why they feel they don't need that support. But again, what that would do to the numbers would be quite extensive. So it's really difficult. In terms of the sort of average hours on the cases, again, it's really difficult to envisage, especially because we're going to be doing work that we haven't done so far, in terms of all of that role at the pre-authorization period. And if we are spending a lot of time with the person, that could add lots of hours on. The impact assessment does allow for the fact that there's a great deal of variation between average hours, from 9 to 81. So to find somewhere in the middle, it's really, really difficult.
And one question I did have, Demi, I don't know if you can answer this, is I'm assuming this is per year.
Yeah.
It's 30 hours per year. Yeah. So yeah, so when you're responding to the consultation, yeah, think about whether this feels right based on your current workload. The other thought I had was about young people and whether 16, 17-year-olds needs a bit of extra time. The reason I say that is because when young people are transitioning to adult services, there's a lot more going on. So bigger decisions, longer term decisions, you know, when it might be more complicated. So just a thought I had, and a kind of a genuine question: might that take a bit more time? Might we need to be a bit more thoughtful and invest more time in that first authorization, rather than say a renewal, you know, 10 years later? Okay, so that's the consultation question. Do you agree with some of the expectations and that are set out? I think we've talked about this, and yeah, I think Neil might make this point because we nicked it from his talk we heard from him a few years ago, last year. But yeah, if 5% of people don't have an appropriate person or an MCA, it's about 15,000 people who don't have any support, which is a lot. That's suddenly a big significant amount of people. Okay, right. Very, very quickly, we're nearly there. Stay with me. 3 more slides, and then you can have a wee. So things to think about right now. You absolutely need to be having discussions with your commissioner now. Absolutely 100% be having proactive, positive conversations about your expectations, your concerns, the opportunities for advocacy to be properly commissioned so that it can deliver what the Mental Capacity Act sets out for it to deliver. So you've got to be having those really positive. Don't go into those meetings fearful. Don't go into those meetings begging. You know, these meetings are about you supporting the local authority to deliver its duties. How can you support the local authority to meet its obligations that's coming? And yes, Nick, you know, the impact assessment sets out how much money. The commissioners at the minute, I think, and there might be commissioners on the call today, it'd be fabulous if you could kind of contribute if you're here. But my impression from commissioners is that they're worried about where the money's going to come. But essentially, they want to commission good advocacy. And that's why it's about you being an ally, isn't it? A team, an alliance, and getting it sorted. Workforce, you need to be having a workforce plan. Where are we going to recruit new staff from? How is it going to impact on your care act teams, your IMHA teams, and being multi-skilled? You're going to have to consider and have a plan to end the people doing RPR role. So is that going to involve redeployment? Is it going to involve redundancy? But there's lots of kind of HR issues because that role, now we know when LPS is launched, the existing system will run up to a year, so that you will still need some people to continue in that RPR role for up to a year. But we need to be planning for that now. Training, very quickly, because it's a little complicated. They need to be trained. We know the Sitting Guilds qualification is there to do this. There are kind of different groups of people. The qualified people won't need to do, we think, any new formal qualification training. We expect if you're qualified as an MCA, that we'll do a conversion course in the new system, because the role isn't fundamentally changing, is it? It's just the system around it's changing and little bits. So there'll be a conversion course. If you're a qualified Care Act advocate or IMHA, you'll need to get IMCA qualified. So talk to your training provider about the best way to do that. And then there's non-qualified advocates. You might have a bunch of RPRs who are brilliant. You need to train. And that's all going to take money. It's all going to take time. That's costed in the impact assessment. So it's about talking to your commissioner. This is an opportunity. Please don't go into these conversations fearful. This is not something to be frightened of. This is about you accessing and talk and work alongside your commissioners. Demi talked before about 16 and 17-year-olds. We've kind of got two groups, haven't we? We've got children's advocacy services who are brilliant at understanding the world of 16, 17-year-olds, but generally speaking, might not have a lot of experience in mental capacity. So for those services, their skill gap is about MCA world. Then you've got the other group. You've got IMCA services who generally kick ass at MCA, but lack the children's world and kind of working with families. So we're going to have to think about where we plug that and how, what systems, what training, what culture we need to be nurturing so that we can do that well from both perspectives. Okay, last slide, and then you can have a wee. Right, Lucy Series just this weekend has done a blog. I will post the link to the blog in the chat box, or maybe Gail, could you do that from the original slide? Thanks. Essentially, she's highlighting this really concerning phenomenon, she called it, which you guys all have heard, where people who have got mental health problems and are feeling suicidal might call up for help. And the response from the mental health service is to say, well, you've got capacity to effectively decide to kill yourself. And because of that, we're not offering you service because you've got capacity. And it's a really insidious, odd, you know, and I've spoken to advocates for a few years about this phenomenon, and kind of, we've never really fixed it, never really, I say we, you know, it's not been addressed. And Lucy has posted this brilliant blog, which suggests actually that's not how the MCA, well, not suggesting, she's clarifying, that's not how the MCA works. And now that the consultation for the Code of Practice is live, perhaps this is a good idea to ask DHSC to clarify in the Code of Practice those types of issues. So this isn't part of the consultation. This is just a freebie. So if you agree that this is kind of an issue, that this is not how the law should work, and that actually it'd be very helpful to have that clarified in the code of practice, then send it as kind of a separate email or add that on to the question about anything else, so that DHSC are appreciative of how important and significant this is. And I think, my friends, that is, I misjudged the time. I'm rubbish at time. Gail, it's your fault. Shouldn't let me do this. So we are going to have a very quick wee and tea break, or what other fluids need to be involved in that discussion. I don't know, up to you. Neil is going to talk to us. Should we say 1:45, Neil? Does that sound?
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks,
Yeah.
Kate.
Excellent. So yeah, I will pop some music up and see you at 1:45.
Welcome to your life. There's no turning back. Even while we sleep, we will find you acting on your best behavior. Turn your back on Mother Nature. Everybody wants to rule the world. It's my own desire. It's my only wrong. Help me to decide. Help me make the most of freedom and knowledge. Nothing ever lasts forever. Everybody wants to grow. There's a new way I won't find you. Holding hands while the walls come tumbling back. When they do, I'll be right behind.
Welcome back. Neil, how did you attach slides in the chat box? This has like changed my world.
It blows your mind, doesn't it? I don't know. I just messed about.
How did you attach them? Is it like a web link?
I don't know. Does it work?
I think so.
I can see a nod. Okay. Marvelous. Yeah, just from Dropbox, Kate.
Dropbox, that's so 1980s.
It's my era.
Right, sorry.
It's my era. Yeah.
Oh, did you like the Tears for Fears then?
Yeah, totally.
Excellent. Did you want me to do your slides, or you're able to?
No, it's fine. Are we good to go?
I think so. Is everybody back? Shout if you're not here. That was a silly question, wasn't it? Yeah, I think let's go for it.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's of all the sort of things that I'm worried about when it comes to LPS, I think the IMCA role is probably the least of them, to be honest. But I thought I'd set out some of the hopes and fears around LPS that relate in particular to the IMCA role. Like just looking at those stats that Kate just referred to, you know, it's great to see, I think, that they're planning to invest, you'd hope, in, you know, 11,500 new IMCAs. The actual role of the IMCA when it comes to the liberty protection safeguards, I think generally is great. So I think, as I say, of all the concerns, and there are lots of concerns relating to this new scheme, I think the one area perhaps for a bit of optimism actually relates to the IMCA role. Anyway, what I thought I'd do on just 2 slides is to try and set out some of the things to look out for, because as was said, you know, we've got less than a month now to go, and we do need to respond to the consultation, because certainly the LPS side of things is pretty pants, to use a complex legal term. And so the more feedback, constructive feedback they get, the better. Like it's very easy, I think, to pull apart the code of practice and criticize it. But I think what would be really helpful is to do that, but then put forward solutions as well. So the more kind of constructive and helpful we can be when feeding back in this consultation, I think the more change we will be able to secure. Anyway, these are sort of 14 good things, because it's quite easy to get lost in all the details. So I've just pulled out here 14 hopes, and then we'll look at some of the fears. So the idea is that some form of representation will be there right at the beginning of the LPS process being triggered. So the code makes that clear. Obviously, whether it's an IMCA or an appropriate person, that needs to be put in place right at the beginning of the process, which I think can only be a good thing. And the code also suggests that an IMCA will need to be installed at the outset if the responsible body cannot identify an appropriate person. And so one thing that we will need to sort of think about when this is being turned into practice is, to what extent might we see IMCAs almost automatically being appointed at the beginning until an appropriate person has been identified? Is that likely to happen? Because obviously if it is, if that's the sort of default position, then that has a massive impact in terms of potential numbers of IMCAs that will be needed. The next good thing, I think, is that if I've got capacity to make my own decision about who I want to represent me, what I call later on representation capacity. If I've got capacity to make a decision about my representative, then I can insist on having an IMCA. So one of the good things I think about LPS is that it gives people much, well, quite a lot of flexibility, I think, in terms of choosing who you want to advocate for you. And you'd have to be pretty well versed, I think, in mental capacity law and advocacy services to actually do this. But certainly the code says, if you've got capacity and you want an IMCA, you'll get an IMCA, or at least all reasonable steps must be taken to secure one for you. So that's good. And also the appropriate person. So if I don't have an IMCA, but instead I have like a family member or a friend acting as an appropriate person, then they too can request an IMCA for themselves. So again, I think that's good news in terms of access to independent advocacy services. It's been mentioned already, but one of the main concerns, certainly from a human rights perspective about LPS, is the lack of deadlines. There is only 2 deadlines within LPS. One is the need to inform people of their rights within 72 hours of having their deprivation of liberty authorized, and the other is the sort of maximum period for the authorization. There aren't any legal statutory deadlines at all when it comes to the actual process, the assessment and authorization process. And so for the code to say that this should not exceed 21 days, I think is good news. But of course, the DOLS scheme has a statutory requirement of 21 days, and that gets breached left, right, and centre. So there's still going to be a huge concern about whether people are being arbitrarily deprived of their liberty during the process. And it's worth stressing, the process of LPS, it could take weeks or months. There's lots of bits within the process that could stall or halt the process from moving on to the next stage. Okay, so I'll say a bit more about that later on. In terms of representation, the starting point as to your representative will be who you want. So your wishes and feelings about who you'd like to represent you, but there are lots of grounds upon which someone might be inappropriate. Chapter 15 gives you lots of examples of the circumstances in which, say, a family member or a friend or an attorney or deputy may not be suitable to act in that role. And obviously, the more grounds there are for someone to be unsuitable, the more demand there will be for an IMCA. The code suggests that the IMCA role is a continuous one. So you get the impression that as an IMCA, you will have a caseload, much as you will do now, I would have thought. But the aim of the game really is for the same IMCA to be involved as far as possible throughout both the assessment and authorization periods. And that's the case where you're acting with the appropriate person, as well as when you're acting for the individual themselves. Contact, there was quite a lot of mention of contact in the chat earlier on. The code says that you should maintain regular contact, preferably face-to-face, but regular contact throughout the period, as this is a continuous role. And as I say, the same IMCA throughout as far as possible. But obviously, whether that's doable depends on funding. So as I say, the sort of legal bits relating to the IMCA role, I think are pretty okay. There's a few areas I'm going to sort of highlight where I'm a bit worried, but generally I think it's all right. The key thing is about funding. So that impact assessment, they're not the most exciting things to read, but it's so important. They've had some estimates from Voiceability, I think, but it's so important to have a look at that carefully, because if this is not properly funded, it doesn't matter how great it looks on paper if it can't be achieved in practice. So funding is a key issue. And number 7, I'm going to talk a bit about, I think one of the big areas of concern generally around LPS is section 4B. You're going to hear a lot about 4B. going forwards. But let me just say the good things about it, and then we'll look at the bad things. So 4B basically is like, for those of you that do IMHA work, it's a bit like a holding power, but without a deadline. So 4B gives people the authority to deprive someone of their liberty in various circumstances, and there's no deadline to that power being exercised. It can be used, for example, if you reasonably believe that I can't consent to these proposed arrangements, and what you're doing is necessary to prevent a serious deterioration in my condition, then they can use 4B whilst we're going through the LPS process. So potentially 4B can be relied on as a detention power for days, weeks, potentially even months, without limit of time. So in human rights terms, it's a big concern. We're probably going to have some case law fairly early on, I would have thought. But the code says, it recognizes that it's a restricting power. So whoever's relying on this power, whether it's a social worker, nurse, doctor, police, could be used by the police or others, they need to make certain organizations and individuals aware if 4B is being relied upon. Okay, so that includes IMCAs. IMCAs, if appointed, should be made aware if 4B is being exercised. And if appointed, the IMCA should also be informed at the same time as the responsible body is being told that this sort of interim or emergency power is being relied upon to detain someone. But obviously you're only going to know about it if you've been appointed. So one of the key issues is, to what extent will integrated care boards, NHS, trusts, local authorities actually be speedy enough in the first place when appointing IMCAs. Number 9, so a key role for the IMCA is to flag up the need for a review from the approved mental capacity professional. So, for example, if I'm perfectly happy, but then it turns out that this is against my wishes, the code is stressing that you really need to flag that up as soon as possible so that we can get that independent scrutiny from an AMCP, which I think is useful. And also there's provision there for the writing of reports. One thing, number 10, one thing I think that we'll end up having to think about quite a bit is in those sorts of cases where someone is being kept somewhere or care and treatment is being provided against their wishes. And against their wishes is a lower threshold than objections. Okay, it's looser than that. So where this is being done against their wishes, if you're the IMCA, one of the issues for you is going to be, well, should I go straight to court or should I first go to the AMCP? And I think I think generally it would be well worth going to the AMCP first if that's an available resource that can be appointed and that scrutiny can be given in a speedy way. But again, it comes back to human resources. Are there going to be enough AMCPs around to do this? But they are specialists. And I anticipate, I hope, that you will often have situations which could be resolved by an AMCP, which may therefore mean that the court of protection is not required. You've always got the right of access to the court, but the issue will be, when do you jump into the court arena rather than first using AMCPs? There's a lot of talk about, how transportable these authorizations are. The code says new placement, new authorization, which I think is good. And as an IMCA, one of the key people I think that we will be focusing on and scrutinizing the evidence of is whoever's providing the necessity and proportionality assessment. The code and the impact assessment, well, certainly the impact assessment dramatically underestimates the work of the necessity and proportionality assessor. That assessor, who could be, again, social worker, nurse, OT, etc. They have a lot to do under LPS, and one of the things the code says is that they should be prepared to question robustly the commissioning bodies and finding out whether they're prepared to fund alternatives that may be more proportionate. So I think thinking ahead, for the IMCA to have a, you know, a sort of close sort of dialogue with whoever's assessed necessity and proportionality is going to be a useful link to have. Nothing can be necessary or proportionate unless there's been a best interest decision. So again, as an IMCA, one of the things that we'll be looking at is whether the central workings of the MCA have been complied with first before LPS has been triggered. And then finally, the other good thing I think about LPS is that it suggests that, a bit like DOLS, we can have conditions on an authorization. And as we know, often that's what can make a massive difference to a person. So, because that's not provided for in the legislation. Okay, they're introducing this through the code, which I think is quite interesting. But just the basic idea that, you know, signing off on an authorization, that's not the end of it. There can be conditions attached to that, which of course, as an IMCA, you can be thinking about, and it's not your job to kind of make sure those conditions are implemented. But if there are conditions, then obviously the IMCA has a role to play in terms of those being fulfilled. So those are the hopes. The fears, this is perhaps what you might want to think about when you're responding to the consultation. So firstly, you don't automatically get a representative. Kate mentioned the 5% that are not expected to have either an IMCA or an appropriate person. I just can't see how that is human rights compliant. The legislation says that these bodies that are responsible for LPS must take all reasonable steps to appoint an IMCA if needed. And again, there's going to be a lot of focus about that. You know, what does that mean? If someone needs an IMCA because they don't have anyone else, but there's only a duty to take all reasonable steps to get an IMCA, that doesn't sound like a particularly weighty safeguard to me. So all reasonable steps, I think, is going to be something that needs to be unpicked. In what sort of circumstances might it be unreasonable for a responsible body to sort out an IMCA for someone? That's a bit odd. The second weird thing, and we've known about this ever since 2019, is that if the person lacks representation capacity, so they lack capacity to express, if you like, who they want to represent them, then it's lawfully possible, and this is the 5%, it's lawfully possible for the responsible body to decide not to appoint someone in their best interests. So I can decide it's not in your best interest actually to have an IMCA. Now, again, I think that's madness. I think the sort of circumstances which they're anticipating there perhaps are end of life cases. But would you be using LPS in that sort of scenario? So 1075, that paragraph gives you a bit of, it fleshes out the detail a bit. But I just think that any responsible body would be on thin ice if they decide that it's not in the person's best interest to have some form of representative. Again, it makes you wonder, how would that comply with the Bournemouth judgment? Because even if, you know, I hate others and professionals and I just want to be by myself, you know, I still need an IMCA, and of course you can then deal with that scenario as appropriate. It might just be a very light touch role that's played, but to deny someone the safeguard on a best interest basis just seems to me to be bizarre. But that's in the legislation, so we're not going to be able to challenge that through the consultation. But perhaps what we can focus on is 1075, and you know, essentially try to limit as much as possible the circumstances in which someone would be denied an IMCA. Number 3, that's been touched on already. So chapter 12, the definition of deprivation of liberty, it seems to me that they're clearly trying to reverse Cheshire West through the back door. So that's just, lots of people are really worried about that. And you've had a look at some of the examples. I've picked up on Jennifer, Jack, and Miss K. Those three scenarios apparently are not deprivations of liberty. When look at it, they clearly are. Advanced consent is going to be interesting. So again, it'd be interesting to express your views on this. What do you think about the idea? And again, this is all being introduced through the code. It's not, Parliament decided not to do this. The government are looking to do this through the code. The idea that with capacity, I can sign away my Article 5 rights, basically. So I can decide in advance to consent to a future deprivation of liberty, which then means I won't need safeguards. Good idea or bad? Worth feeding back on, I would say. Number 5. So there's a question over how much work and scrutiny is required if the person's arrangements are pretty stable. And bear in mind, you can be detained for up to 12 months, and then up to 3 years. So one of the questions is about, to what extent should we be expecting sort of reassessments if the person's arrangements are stable and their condition hasn't changed? Because the code suggests that essentially you can just rely on previous assessments there. Is that sufficiently robust, I think is the question. Number 6, where the attorney or deputy is agreeing to a care home placement, they should not be appointed as the appropriate person. This is quite interesting. AJ is obviously the key case in that regard. And number 6 seems to go way beyond AJ. So AJ says, as you know, that, if I've got health and welfare LPA and I've, moved my gran into a care home, where she's deprived of her liberty, then I might not be able to act as the RPR. Will not. Much will depend on whether I would nevertheless be willing to pick up the phone and call a lawyer if the case needs to go to court. So I think number 6 is quite interesting, because obviously there are lots of health and welfare LPAs out there. And if they can't be appointed as an appropriate person on the back of that, then we're going to need even more RMCAs. Yeah, because the estimate is that there'll be an appropriate person in about 75% of cases, with IMCAs in the other 25%. So number 6 is quite important, again, in terms of the numbers of IMCAs that might be required. And one of the big safeguards is the AMCP. And you're entitled to an AMCP if it's reasonable to believe that you don't wish to be here or you don't wish to receive care or treatment here. So those against the wishes cases. The worrying bit, though, about the code is that it talks about thresholds. So how you have to hit a threshold to sort of qualify for this particular safeguard. And so I've just given you the key paragraph there, 1830. It would be reasonable to believe that a person doesn't wish to reside in or receive care and treatment at a place if there is valid evidence to support this belief. Okay, where possible, this should be presented in writing. So they're looking for written evidence to be entitled to this AMCP safeguard. It says it doesn't require absolute certainty, but good evidence will be needed to show why there is a belief that the criterion in question is met. So this, I think, rubs up against the AD decision that's been, I think, mentioned earlier on. AD, really helpful, I think. It's mainly in the context of, when do we need to go to court? But AD kind of sets the bar pretty low in that regard, whereas this seems to raise it slightly. So that is worthy, I think, of a response in the code, because it's, when you get an AMCP, it is a key issue under this new scheme. And certainly my view is that if there's going to be any talk of a threshold, obviously it needs to be sensible, but crucially, it needs to be the lower the better, really. We'd much rather have, more AMCPs called out than not called out when they should be. 8 and 9 are all about 4B. So let me just expand on 4B. So you're going to hear a lot about this. We're going to be using 4B all the time in LPS. All right. It's going to be one of the most relied upon sections, I imagine, of the Mental Capacity Act. So 4B basically says, I can deprive you of your liberty if I reasonably believe that you lack capacity to consent to what I'm doing, and what I'm doing is necessary either to give you life-sustaining treatment or to do a vital act. Now, vital act is the key bit here. So I can detain you if it's necessary to do a vital act, and that means preventing a serious deterioration in your condition. Bear in mind, I say it's like a holding power, it's like a detention power without limit of time. So that power can be used in 3 scenarios, but one of them is when we're going through the process of LPS. So if you, on average, I think DOLS takes about, I think it's 148-day waiting time or something ridiculous for DOLS at the moment. If that doesn't change, that's potentially the kind of period we're looking at. 4B might be used not just to cover a few days here and there, but potentially weeks or even months, depending on how long the assessment and authorization process takes. So the meaning of a vital act is really important. And the code says that examples, number 8, examples include delivering care and support. Wow. Delivering care and support can be a vital act. That is massively broad in its interpretation. And obviously, the broader the definition of vital act is, the more scope there is to detain people without limit of time. Okay, so it's a huge issue. And the code, I think, is quite worrying, actually. Some of the examples it gives of when this power is used or could be used is quite a concern. So number 9, it might be possible to rely on 4B to carry out steps to prevent a person from returning to their family home from respite if this poses a risk to the person's family. So notice it's like a holding power. You can rely on it to stop the person going home from respite if there's a risk, not just to me, but a risk to family. And then 19.5, right? If there's one paragraph of this code that you look at 19.5. 4B is used as an example there to move someone into a care home and detain them there on a 4B basis. Okay, so lots of concerns. Have a look at all the bits around 4B, please. And if you've got a view, do express it, because health and social care practitioners are going to use this all the time whilst they're sort of going through the LPS process, but also in emergency scenarios. So one of the key questions is, okay, well, what safeguards do you get in a 4B scenario? Okay, well, you should have some form of representative. So either an IMCA or an appropriate person should be in place during that period. Okay, whether they will be, I think, remains to be seen, but you should have, especially if this could go on for weeks, you should have some form of representative in the meantime. But what about legal aid? That's the big one. Now, free legal aid is available for IMCAs who act as litigation friend when you're going to court. Okay, so there is free legal aid to challenge, and this is all according to the code. Like, we don't have the detailed legal aid regulations at the moment, but according to the code, free legal aid available for IMCAs if you're acting as a litigation friend when you're challenging an authorization in court. Well, the section 21ZA scenarios, but that's only if there's an authorization. But what if you've been locked up under a 4B basis for weeks, potentially months? Well, this is the concern. It says that legal aid is free for the person or their appropriate person. Doesn't mention the IMCA. Now, I don't know if that's just an oversight or whether it's on purpose, but that seems to suggest to me that if you've got an IMCA on a 4B case, then there may not be free legal aid. And if that's right, that's a massive concern, because, you know, in these sort of delayed cases, and there'll be loads of delayed cases with LPS, it's really important that there is free legal aid available to enable IMCAs to effectively challenge what's going on in court. Okay. And then the final one is all about renewing authorizations. And again, it suggests that in certain circumstances, essentially the renewal can be done on a very, very light touch basis. So it's another example of the safeguards being watered down. All right. So anyway, those are some of the sort of main hopes and a list of some of the fears, tears for fears, when it comes to LPS. Anyway, on that note, I'll hand back to Kate whilst I just look at what's coming in the chat.
Thank you, Neil. I will be totally honest, and 4B has passed me by. So you've got some, I'm going to definitely get called to action on that one. Gail, did you want to jump in with any questions that the people have been posting?
Yeah, so lots of questions about 4B. Will responsible bodies complete a 4B whilst waiting for LPS?
Yeah.
Will there be a time limit on 4B?
No.
Assuming that 4B doesn't have the full safeguard as LPS?
No. There are no assessments done in a 4B case, you see. So, you know, it's a bit like a kind of, if you know about Section 5 of the Mental Health Act, it's kind of a bit similar to that, in that I think I need to detain you. But, you know, whilst we sort everything out, my back is legally covered in the interim. That's what it's designed for. But unlike Section 5 of the Mental Health Act, there is no deadline.
Sorry. Somebody else asking about the use of 4B with hospital discharge.
Yeah. So again, if you look at paragraph 19.5, you know, you could run with that, in which case I can discharge you into care home confinement on a 4B basis. Massive concern. You see, and the reason I'm kind of banging on about it is because you know, those early moments, as we all know, those early moments are often critical in terms of options. Yeah. You know, options can go during a 4B period. Do you know what I mean? So it's really important to have adequate safeguards in a 4B case. Otherwise, you could already have a done deal by the time that an authorization is provided.
Someone else asking, is there a time limit as to when representation should be involved, such as when somebody is arrested and their rights to access legal advice?
It's not set out in the Act. The code says ASAP. So if we focus on 4B as an example, the IMCA or appropriate person should be installed as soon as is practicable. But again, obviously that's vague. There's no statutory deadline there.
And somebody else asking, has 4B come from the legislation or just implemented from the code? Can the consultation change this?
See, that's a very angry dog. They're not keen on 4B either. So 4B has come from the legislation. So 4B is contained in the legislation, but it's quite kind of generally phrased. The code, though, in terms of how it's interpreted, that's the worrying bit. It's about how it's interpreted in the code. So yes, the consultation can dramatically change the way 4B is used in practice to try and avoid the sort of paragraph 19.5 scenario. Because if you look at 19.5, you'll think, oh my God, there's nothing there at all. You can just move people into confinement without any safeguards. And so there is a way to effectively influence the way that 4B is interpreted in the code, for sure.
And I think this is the last question, although Kate's just popped in the chat. So if anybody's got a question they want to ask Neil, put your hand up. I think the last one that I can see is someone asking if there's any definitions of what risk might be. So is there any definition of risk? So could someone be prevented from returning home where there is a risk to others?
So according to the code, they can be. And was it 1915? I think if you look at 1915, you'll see that set out. So you could be prevented from going home from respite if this poses a risk to your family. Obviously, that's sort of touching on a much broader debate about to what extent can the Mental Capacity Act be used to protect others as well as the person that lacks capacity to make the decision. But certainly 1915 would suggest that there's no definition of risk there, but I anticipate they're probably thinking of risk of physical harm to a family member.
Katie, Kate, I think you had your hand up first. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you. Yeah, at the start you said that the LPS isn't transferable. So would that also come into fact with hospitals? So if someone's in an acute hospital in one county and they need to go to community hospital in another county, they'd still need to go through the same process again? Or would that LPS transfer, although it's the same health board, would it transfer with them or not?
So it's not as portable as I think people were hoping it to be years ago. It is broader than what we have in the sense that it can cover a number of settings. So I'll come back to your scenario, Kate, in a minute, but just very quickly, if, for example, I'm in supported living and I go to a day service, it can basically cover the entirety of the care plan, all of those arrangements, even though care and support is being provided in different settings. So that's not transferable, but it's more overarching in that sense because it can kind of cover and safeguard all of those arrangements, including transport to the day service, etc., etc. But in terms of moving someone from one hospital to another, it wouldn't automatically flow to the other hospital. I anticipate that we'll end up making quite a lot of use of prior evidence. So, if Hospital A has LPS in place with evidence of incapacity, mental disorder assessed in proportionality, then I think the new hospital will make very heavy reliance on that. So it won't necessarily be a whole load of fresh assessments, but it's not sort of automatically ported to the new place, because obviously, the arrangements can feel very different in two different hospitals. Does that make sense, Kate?
It could be treatment in one and then rehab in another, couldn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, and then Pat.
Hi, yeah, it was really just a bit more clarification. I don't think I phrased the question very well. When I was asking about is there any definition of risk when we're talking about somebody returning home after respite? I have a real concern about that because just the definition and also the level of evidence for that as well. I've been involved in quite a lot of cases where family, for various reasons, just don't want dad or mum or husband or partner home.
Yeah. So there's no to define risk. I'm sure there are academics out there that have tried it, but that's a tall order. But I think the key point really is that it's about necessity and proportionality in light of that risk. So You know, a classic example, I'm sure, Pat, this is the sort of cases that you've had as well. Classic example of the family saying, look, I just can't cope anymore. They need to be in residential care because we can't cope as a family. And let's say that, you know, there is a risk of, I don't know, emotional harm if this was to happen. There's probably a risk of financial harm if I'm going to have to pay for these care home fees. But there could be a risk of emotional, potentially a risk of physical harm as well. And so the nub of it really, I think, you know, if you're looking for a definition of risk, you know, that's quite a difficult task, but the place to focus is really on necessity and proportionality. So if these are the risks, you know, why is it necessary and proportionate to confine me to a care home in those circumstances, as opposed to, you know, having a carer's assessment, for example, and looking at putting in further support to help my stressed out wife who feels as though she can't cope. But surely you could do something for her, you know, weekly spa breaks or something, maybe can address that risk. Pat, do you want to come back in on that just before I go to Jeremy?
No, that I'm with you. It's, yeah, I get that, you know, a definition of risk is a big ask. It's whether or not there's sufficient within the guidance to promote looking at, you know, different areas.
Yeah, it's about reasonable belief of
Okay.
that risk and why this is necessary and proportionate. And it's worth just stressing that those are two different things. I think quite often people see it as a conflated thing. It's not. It's got to be necessary and proportionate. They are two different. They do two different things. Do those tests, Jeremy?
And if we make this the last question so that we can have a bit of time for breakout. So Jeremy, over to you for the last cue. Thank you.
Okay, brevity is not usually my watchword, but I shall try. I guess I was going to come back with a comment on risk. Really, that's about, I absolutely agree the definitions of risk are really difficult, but it is about pushing back to the professionals who are voicing what they would say is a risk, and that a risk should be quantified and use a structured procedure, because it's about a probability statement as opposed to a possibility. And I find a lot of time those two things are conflated. So it's about people feeling able to go and push back to professionals over that. In a hospital setting, it's far more likely that you'd have a structured risk assessment, but in other settings, it tends to get conflated with a potential, which is not the same as a risk assessment.
Absolutely. And to be fair, I suppose, to health and social care professionals, they have to, you know, the word risk is used in the Mental Capacity Act, so they have to consider risk. But risk is an absolute nightmare to predict, and I don't think anyone would pretend that they are very good at assessing risk, because none of us have a crystal ball. We just do our best.
And it's a human need,
Yeah.
isn't it? It's yeah. Neil, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Genuinely, thank you. Should we show our appreciation? Okay, I am now going to give you not one, not two, but three options. Can I get a ooh? Ooh, three options. Oh, aren't I so lucky? Option one, which you don't want to pick. Option one, which you won't want to pick, is to go. You can go, but you won't want to do that when you hear about the second option, because the second option is the bit where the real magic happens. The second option is in your group discussion rooms, and we have got 7 amazing facilitators who are going to guide you through some questions. And this, guys, is it is where the magic happens. This is where you're thinking, this is where you're sharing, and most importantly, contributing. So this is your community. We want you to contribute to the discussion. So I'm going to get Susie to wave, Jane Kingston to wave, if your camera's on, Jane, Amanda Lewis to wave. We've got Sophie Postlethwaite, got Lily Gaddam, all these gorgeous people waving, and Gail, Demi and myself. So we're all going to facilitate each of these rooms. So that's kind of your second option. So please do, as I say, this is your moment to, this is my moment. You know, get stuck in with these ideas. And then the third option is I will actually stay here for 5-6 minutes if you've got a specific question, but only stay if you've got a specific question. We want you to contribute and get stuck in. This is our opportunity. Is that all right? Give me a hell yeah. Hell yeah.
Oh yeah.
Woo! Hell yeah. Okay, so you're going to go into breakout rooms and then we will come back just to say thank you and goodbye in 20 minutes. Okay, so have fun. Hi, Sue. You okay?
Yeah, I was just leaving my room because I'm having to leave because I've got another training, but thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. All right, take care. You okay?
Yes, I'm okay. Just got a really want this in my breakout room.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm going to move you into roommate. Okay, thanks, Lily. Good idea. Bye. Okay. Yes. No. Thanks, Lily. Bye.